This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partner Paul Weiss and contributing partners National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and once again it's my pleasure to welcome my co-host Scott Cutler with the NYSE Euronext. Scott, welcome. You haven't been back for a while, so it's nice to have you back on the set, and you've been traveling the world, and one of those stops in the world was the World Economic Forum, and you gave us a little update in that cold weather with your breath showing, but I thought maybe we'd just take the beginning of the show and just have you comment on what your feelings were relative after you completed your stay there.
Yeah, well, clearly as the leaders convened on Davos, the rest of the world didn't burn. But it is always interesting to come out of that event, and my perspective this year was certainly one being reshaped by the global financial crisis is really the opportunity to think globally. The rules, the competitive topology are changing so dramatically that it requires management teams and boards to think about a global environment that's also impacted by political changes and economic changes very rapidly. And so I think that's the one thing you have to consider.
Well, this was our first shot to do something actually from Davos, so I'm hoping that next year we can even be a little more sophisticated and maybe even have a guest from Davos. That would be great. Well, it's interesting that you're coming back for this session because we're going to be talking about something today that's about as sensitive as we can get in the boardroom. This is the 900-pound gorilla that sort of is always there, and that's mandatory retirement and term limits. Those are issues that really nobody likes to discuss, and as I see it, the older I get, the less I want to discuss it. But I think that that's standard. But you and I have never talked about this issue, so it's going to be interesting to see where we come out on that. So let's start with the mandatory retirement. I'll let you start off.
At the high level, I have a problem with a one-size-fit-all approach to any board. For this particular issue, I think there are two sides to the corporate governance balance. The first side is really the need for having knowledgeable and experienced directors is critically important in this environment. And if you look at the trend has been the average age on boards has been increasing over the last 10 years. On the other hand, you have to be able to set up an infrastructure that creates enough turnover to ensure that the company's perspective is fresh and current and relevant. And so I think that's the balance. So I don't think you're going to find me on one side or the other. I think every board has to weigh both of those sides and make sure that you've got an infrastructure to be able to accomplish the need for change.
Well, we've always been proponents of one size doesn't fit all, so that part of it isn't strange. I'm sure I could argue both sides of this argument fairly well, and I guess that's what makes it so difficult. But at the same time, there's probably the most common argument right now is that neither age requirement or term limits is required if a board is doing an effective board evaluation. If you're analyzing the skills that you have on the board, and let's take the example of somebody does become out of touch or whatever. In the course of that evaluation, it should become apparent, and then it's the responsibility of the chairman or the lead director, or sometimes even working with the CEO to make the decision that this is somebody that probably shouldn't be nominated. Now, that is not an easy thing for a board to do, though.
I would agree. To me, again, the macro picture is, number one, you should be focused on long-term value creation, and so the board should reflect that. Number two, I do think that boards need to be able to redefine or define responsibilities in a more current function. And 3, I would agree with you, considering performance is critical. Now, all of that taken into account, to me, this is an issue of how do you create turnover. Term limits, performance, age limits, all deal with the issue, I think, with performance. How is it that you create an environment where a director is actually performing to what you're actually requiring? If that is your consideration, then there are a host of things that you can put in place to make sure that boards are performing at the level that they should. On the other hand, if you are focused as a board and concerned about power or concentration of power or the undue influence of people that have been there too long, then I think you need to figure out the structure that would eliminate that or reduce the impact of that concentration of power or weeding out those difficulties. I think the second piece is probably more of an issue or more difficult to realize and to address and put in place an infrastructure to take care of it.
But when you think about it, the age requirement is the most graceful way to have somebody exit. Okay, it's not, it keeps the collegiality on the board, and it's just a graceful way. Now, is it right for some and not right for others? But the point is, to set that, you're setting a graceful exit. Agree?
No, I think it's a cop-out. I think performance overrides everything. If you've got an individual who's serving and is productive on every single metric, then I don't see why age would be an issue. I would want Warren Buffett on my board, and he would cross over most age limits. And so that's my point. I think it's irrelevant unless you have other issues that you have to address. And I don't see that as something that I would put in place.
Well, hold that thought for a minute, because we'll get back to that in a second. But let's talk about term limits, which are different.
Right.
Okay, term limits standard is 10, 12, 15 years that somebody has. So the argument is, if somebody's been there for 15 years, that they start to become, this is an argument, they start to become less dependent, they sort of get in a little bit of a rut. You also might argue that if somebody has been retired for a long time and has served, are they still savvy in the business? So the term limits give you the opportunity to, again, turn your board over, make sure that you have diversity of thought, bringing different ages on, different types. You keep that evolving board, which is certainly of value. But it seems that when people talk about term limits, everybody's in favor of it till it comes time to vote them in.
Yeah. Well, again, on the balance issue, maybe that's the way I'm going to come out on most of the discussions today. Constant turnover for a board is bad. Even the issue of annual election of directors, I think, is a challenge if you're every year trying to think about whether or not a director should be there or not. So as I look at term timeframes, it's certainly well beyond a year, and it's probably in the 2 or 3 years before you understand and can truly contribute. And so it's probably between that 3 to 5 years where you're probably a fully functioning board member if you were having to get up to speed in a particular company. And so I think that's the one thing that you should be focused on in terms of performance. And then after that, if you have to put in an artificial term limit to create that turnover, and you're doing that for the reason of having a fresh perspective, then you ought to be able to stick to that.
Well, this is the $64,000 question then. You have worked with a lot of boards. You know a ton of board members. Do you think, given the tools and the things that are available today, and knowing that the boards that you've witnessed, do you think today that boards have the capability to evaluate themselves and have the moxie to take action so that in the perfect world, no age, no term, we're just making evaluations on performance?
I think we're at the beginning phases of the cycle where performance matters on the board. So I think the answer to your question is capability, yes. Is it actually in practice for most boards? I would say no. I think it's a responsibility, again, to look at performance on the board through a very different lens than you had in the past.
Well, I think that gets back to the idea that one size doesn't fit all. I mean, you can give examples. You know, I can remember Bill Seidman, you know, in his later days being on multiple boards, and he's like a Warren Buffett. He was so valuable on his experience and what was happening. But at the same time, I certainly can develop the argument of why diversity of thought and having a spread. And perfect example is social media.
Sure.
Look at the impact that social media is having on companies today. You literally can't have a board of all 75-year-olds because I'm assuming that while some of them may be social media savvy, the point is that you need to understand how that is affecting your business going forward. So there's an example where fresh blood would be important.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say gone are the days where a board member just sits because they want to be a director. I believe that today what's required of a director is significantly greater than what it was 10 years ago. And so I think gone are the days of a director sitting on, you know, multiples and multiples of boards simply because of the demands that are placed on them. And so I think your point about social media is a great one, because today what's required of a board member is to contribute, to have a lot of relevance, and to be able to help in not the management, but guiding the management towards new and fresh issues, not just sitting back and waxing philosophical. You got to be in the weeds. And so that, I think, lends itself to more turnover, fresher perspective, having performance as an important element. And I mean, social media would be one element, to have some element on your board that has a perspective on that.
Well, one thing that's certainly going to affect the age limits is look at the companies out there that have young CEOs. And I mean late 20s, early 30s, that are going to, by middle 30s, have all the experience that you would want on a board. And if you said that you were going to put people on in their 30s, you know, you'd never would have thought that in the past. But I think it's going to be a very real issue going forward. So
again, I guess it reinforces my point where age is less relevant.
Yeah.
I mean, either on the young side and maybe on the older side as well.
Well, I hope you're right, because the best solution to this whole situation of age and term limits is the evaluation process and evaluating that performance. I think we see the challenges of that. And I think investors are helping boards come to grips with that. Okay, so that's a positive way, not in an activist sense on that, but just saying that, hey, we're okay with, you know, a blend of board members, but we want to make sure that, you know, that an evaluation process is going on. So,
yeah.
Well, you know, this is something that we don't have to talk about for a while, but it's something we hadn't talked about that I think we can be helpful to our viewers. So thanks for joining me on that topic. It's glad to have you back. So just before we depart, I just want to make one announcement. We have a corporate board member has a risk conference coming up on April 3rd, and we're lucky enough to have Preet Bahara, who is on the cover of Time magazine, who is the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. And he's going to be talking about investigations. And so if you're a sitting audit committee member out there, you may really enjoy our risk event, which is here at the Exchange on April 3rd. And he's going to be a fascinating individual to listen to. So we invite you to come to that. Go to the website and you can get all the information. So with that, we want to thank you for joining us today, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week when we cover another issue of This Week in the Boardroom that will help you be a better committee member and board member.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by Corporate Board Member and host NYSE Euronext, along with Governance Knowledge Partner Paul Weiss and contributing partners National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.